with that, I'm going to turn to the topic today, which is finance and administration, which sounds really dull and relatively unimportant, but it is actually pretty important. And I want to give a rationale for why paying attention to this is important. I have to acknowledge that the original version of these slides developed 6 years ago were by Martha McClatchy, who's in the class now. So it's with some trepidation that I deliver a talk that she built the core of some times ago. So thank you, Martha.
Chris, I'm flattered. I'm flattered. I don't take any of it. I'm giving it all back to you.
Yeah, right. So the big idea here is, are you really in charge of what's happening in the company? Are you really running the company, or are you just watching it happen? And it's a real issue because there are certainly some characteristics of running a company where you get so caught up in critical activities, developing the product, finding the first customers, that you're not necessarily paying attention to the background trends and finding mechanisms by which you can get up to 40,000 feet and look at what is the macro trend, what are happening in some of the quiet corners, which are really important, is critical. And forcing a mechanism on yourself by which you watch for those silent killers is important. And clearly one of the silent killers is cash. If you're not paying close attention to what's going on in the finance line, you may suddenly wake up one day and say, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to pay people in 2 months' time. What do we do about that? So you want to put yourself in a position where you know where you are. And that means paying attention to these things. Sometimes it's also issues with legal or space or human resources, people questions. They all have this potential to be silent killers. So you want to figure out both how to watch them and develop disciplines so that as you add more threads to what you're trying to do, you're in a better position to keep track of those things, even while you're doing the big stuff, the building the product, the finding the customers. So let's talk a little bit about some of the essential structures that you need. I would say that finance and administration is a domain by itself, but it's also a kind of code word for having and following a plan, of having a sense that you're working on the most urgent things, but you're also paying attention to these other patterns of activity that are taking place. And it reflects the fact that you are running a business, and there are both practical and legal aspects of running a business that you need to make sure that you're on top of. Not to the point that having structure is a substitute for having a great product or having a great way to engage with customers. It all has to happen together. And it's part of what makes leadership of a startup tricky, is that you're trying to pay attention to the urgent and the important simultaneously. So becoming a successful business is both an end in itself, in the sense that you need to make sure that you are financially, legally, checking the right boxes, but also it's a necessary condition for growing a startup, that if you don't have those structures, it becomes very difficult indeed to add more money, add more people, add more space, add more resources. And therefore, it's worth spending some attention to, how do I set that up? It doesn't have to be a lot, but it's something that is always in the back of leadership's mind, asking the question, am I doing what I need to do to make sure that more and more of this is confidently taken care of over time? And it's particularly tricky, I think, in the early days when you don't have dedicated staff for these things. You don't have anybody whose job says, keep track of the stuff that's not one of the top three goals of the company. But it's really important because it represents how the top three actually get done, and it represents how you cover the other 10 things that are mandatory for starting a company. I think that the core of finance and administration is supplying the resources and creating the structures that makes all the other work possible. Do you compensate people? Are you able to pay your expenses? Assuming you're not a company that operates entirely in the online space, do you have the office space? In any case, do you have the computers and the tools necessary to get the work done? Are you meeting at least the basic legal requirements for the corporate structure, for paying any taxes that you owe, for being in basic compliance with state and national laws? And are you finding and retaining the right team? Clearly, a startup is all about the team. And so the process of finding the right team is partly having the right relationships and the right mission and the right communication to that team. But there's a lot of mechanics around it as well. You need to have offer letters. You need to have stock agreements. You need to have benefits plans and other things, and those don't happen by themselves. The second dimension of financial activity that's really important is it's a way of keeping score. It's a way of knowing whether you are making progress by measuring the business performance. Starting out, at the beginning, you have expenses, but no revenue. How are the expenses being handled? Are you paying your bills on time? How are your expenses growing? Where are you expecting to get revenue from? Is it coming in on time? Are the bookings coming in on time? Are the deliveries happening on time? Are you collecting cash from your customers on time? All of those are key measures, and you need to have triggers in place so that you flag things which are a mismatch to your expectations. But it also is important in the sense that it helps you plan out how that's going to go. I mean, just take the relationship between booking and revenue and cash as an example. These are three material events associated with getting customers committed to what you're doing. But you need to have an understanding that a booking is when the customer agrees, in theory, irrevocably to take the product. Revenue is when you have fulfilled the obligation that you have made to the customer. And cash is when they actually delivered money to your bank account. And sometimes those can be stretched out in time, sometimes over a year or more. And if you don't understand that cash typically will follow booking by a significant amount of time, you can think you're in great shape because of all your bookings, but you're actually going out of business. And finally, finance is really a source of innovation for some kinds of business, especially, that it's a place where you can say, I recognize that my customers have both a product need, but they also have a financial need associated with using my stuff. A great case, and I saw it actually come up in one of the startup plans that I was reviewing. Is there an insurance element? Is that something where you can provide some greater assurance that a business really needs? But if you're going to take on insurance, now you have to think through the numbers in great detail. What are your risks? How are you going to pay out on claims? what is the revenue and the timing of the revenue you get from essentially insurance premiums. It may be ways in which, for example, you are successful only if customers are successful because you've established milestones, or you have a royalty model which is tied to your customers' volume of shipments or the value of the shipments they make. All of those are critically important pieces of innovation, but they percolate through your financial plan in a big way, creating both opportunities and, in some cases, significant risks. It also creates leverage for additional differentiation in the relationship with both customers and suppliers. If you can provide something that mitigates their risk, and or improves the certainty compared to other possible offerings. So there is a lot of leverage in this mundane phrase of finance and administration. And we're going to walk through a number of aspects of it here. Now, there is another view, which I don't disagree with, but it's a little bit at odds with this presentation, which is to say, maybe you can ignore a lot of this. Paul Graham, who's founder of Y Combinator, said, basically, they skipped all of the stuff that you are supposed to do. Insurance, business license, unemployment compensation, various things with the IRS, up to the point at which they got real funding. And then they hired a great head of finance and administration who fixed everything retroactively. It turns out no one comes and arrests you. And that's true. You're really under the radar as a startup, which is not an invitation to permanently ignore these things. But you shouldn't get over obsessed with them, because it's certainly the case that if you do finance and administration right, and you don't do the other things right, building a great product, finding customers, it doesn't matter how great your finance and administration was. So let's put on your finance hat and think about what are some of the basic things that you should do. Determine that you can trust your attorney. You may or may not have any financial advisors, but you certainly want to stay out of the worst case scenario that somebody's scamming you. Somebody is going to use a financial relationship with your company to steal your money. So establishing some trust in those advisors, because you don't want to have to think about that. I've actually found that having a good attorney is great. They won't tell me how to do the financing, but they've been in the room where essentially all of the critical financial decisions are being made. And they understand that because there are fiduciary responsibilities when you take money from an investor, the attorney has to be in a position to tell you when you're being financially irresponsible, because that also represents legal irresponsibility, and they care about that. It pays to educate yourself a little bit about accounting so you know how it works, know the difference between cash accrual, cash and accrual-based accounting, understand the difference between bookings and revenue and cash collection. QuickBooks is a great tool. It's a basic accounting package. It's used pretty universally. I'm sure it's available as an online application as well as a traditional Edge application. And you can actually go a long way. We ran Tensilica as on QuickBooks up until the point where we were seriously considering going public. And then we started to plan out what sort of tools we were going to need to be able to meet the public accounting requirements. So we ran it on QuickBooks for 16 years and grew to and booked, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. through a QuickBooks-based accounting system, and it works. So understanding accrual versus cash is really basic idea, and something you have to internalize that that cash is the last thing that happens in a transaction, but the timing of cash is really important, particularly since customers will use cash as leverage, and that's really scary. They can say, yeah, 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 we signed a contract, and yeah, 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 you more or less delivered, and yeah, 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 in principle, I owe you this cash, but in reality, uh, our CEO said that not to pay the cash until we get this one new thing that we want, and so people will rewrite the contract in practice by withholding cash, and you need to be really careful about that. Both because it means you have to do unplanned work in order to get the cash you fully planned, and because it calls into doubt everything that you've done so far. You called something revenue, meaning you said that you had fulfilled all the obligations of a contract, but in fact, the customer is saying, no, you didn't. There was an unstated uh, obligation that you have in order to get cash. And it completely muddles the question of have you done what you promised to do if the customer keeps moving the goalposts. You need to understand some basics about the balance sheet. What do you have for assets and for liabilities? How much do you owe people that you're going to have to pay? And what are long-term versus short-term? What am I going to have to pay out as cash this month, next month, and month after that? And how does that affect cash flow? As well as liabilities that may be long-term things that you don't have to pay anything right now, but sooner or later it comes due. And the basic question of, is this a going concern? Can this organization persist in time is important. And that's critically important when your uh, liquid assets fall below your liabilities, because then you have obligations sitting out there that you can't necessarily pay from the assets you have, and that your survival depends on what new cash you can bring in. And you need to understand when you're in that place. In general, of course, you create liabilities earlier and bigger than you create real liquid assets. Yes, you raise money, and that puts you in a good position for a while, but there is the essential assumption that you're going to start having more assets, more useful assets than near-term, mid-term liabilities in order to continue to grow, to be able to add people, to be able to build more product. You also have to understand the profit and loss statement. It's not as if you are expected to generate a profit from early on. You may go through a period of years when you're making a loss along the way. And investors understand that. They will look at things like revenue growth in preference to profit and loss, but they are all ultimately looking for a business that makes a profit. In tech, it is often the case, it is often the assumption that as long as you're growing revenue, you're creating latent assets, relationships with customers, a technology foundation, which will later naturally, by virtue of scale, turn profitable. I remember in the early days of Facebook, there was they went public, I think, at a time when they were still making a loss, and people questioned whether they would switch over into profit generation. And the sophisticated theory was, yes, of course, they have generated such a network of users that Yes, of course, the company will find better and better ways to monetize all those relationships. In fact, it turned out to be emphatically true. But understanding where you are in a profit and loss basis, as well as even more importantly, figuring out where you are on a cash flow basis is critically important. I think that maintaining a dashboard, having a set of metrics which are relevant to your business that tell you some basic financial health information is important. Starting with your burn rate. How are you using up your cash? Um, Starting to get an understanding of profit margin and profit. Uh, Understanding profit margin tells you a lot about whether you are pricing your products and services the right way. Are you figuring out how to get your costs for delivery of that service into the right place? And what happens if you scale? If you're only making 10% margin on your product, you're going to need an enormous amount of volume growth before you start actually having a significantly profitable and cash flow positive business. If you're spending almost as much, sending dollars to other people almost as fast as you're bringing dollars in. Understanding accounts receivable, that is money that people have promised you that you have not yet received, is important because of the fact that everybody knows that startups need cash. And so the more Machiavellian of the customers will be quite manipulative about it. But even if you have all good customers who pay on time, are you really fulfilling all your obligations? Are you really on top of the time constants involved? And of course, the sales forecast is one of the most basic metrics. How are you and your sales team at the point that you start to have a sales team looking at the business going forward? Not just in aggregate, well, how excited are customers out there? Or what have they said that they will buy sometime? What are they going to buy next month? What are they going to buy this next quarter? What does the rest of the year look like? Because you need to plan at these different timescales to understand your cash flow, understand your business trajectory. So those are really, I would say, the most essential things from a finance perspective.